Have you ever stopped to wonder how today's really intense moral panics, those big collective fears about secret cults or hidden dangers, how they actually got started?
It's a great question.
It might really surprise you, I think, to learn just how far back the roots of these things go.
Yeah, we're not talking like just a few decades or even a century.
No, not at all. We're planning to dive deep, really deep, into medieval Europe today. We want to understand how these profound societal anxieties first really took shape.
Exactly. Because while the phrase Satanic Panic immediately makes most people think of the 1980s and 90s, right?
Right. The ritual abuse scares, the daycare cases.
All of that. That whole wave of paranoia, what some people even called modern-day witch trials at the time. But the actual mechanisms behind panics like that are much, much older.
Mechanisms
Like intense scapegoating, for one. The construction of these really elaborate, detailed conspiratorial narratives, and just this overwhelming collective fear of unseen, malevolent forces working behind the scenes.
And those mechanisms, those sort of ancient blueprints for panic, they have really deep historical roots.
Incredibly deep.
So our mission, our goal for this deep dive is to journey back into medieval Europe and explore these, well, frankly, surprising historical antecedents.
We'll be looking at how pervasive societal anxieties, the church's evolving and, frankly, increasingly rigid role, and these very specific accusations, witchcraft, heresy, sexual deviance, how they all got tangled up with the power dynamics at the time.
Power is key here, isn't it?
Absolutely central. We really want to uncover the historical blueprints for how societies have, again and again, scapegoated certain groups and spun these conspiracy theories around perceived evil forces.
And a really critical part of this journey, I think, will be trying to differentiate, between what might have been actual practice by some groups.
Which is often murky and hard to pin down.
Right, versus what was really just a polemical accusation, a charge that was designed purely to demonize or suppress or maybe seize power or property.
Precisely. It's not just about cataloging what horrors happened in these dark chapters of history, though that's important. It's crucially about understanding why it mattered. How these ingrained fears laid such formidable foundations for centuries of prejudice, impacting, countless lives.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Where do we even begin?
Well, to truly grasp the origins of these fears, we really need to start by setting the scene. You have to try and envision the medieval landscape. It was a world just saturated with fear.
So we're talking, what, roughly 500 to 1500 CE?
That's the broad time frame, yeah. And it was an era almost universally marked by immense societal anxiety, pervasive oppression for most people, and just this profound, almost relentless sense of despair.
Life was just incredibly precarious, fragile, often brutal.
It really was. A time when life hung by a thread, Stability was a luxury most people just never experienced. You had recurring waves of devastating illnesses.
Like the plagues.
Exactly. The infamous plagues that could wipe out huge percentages of the population in like a few months. You had devastating crop failures leading to widespread famine, unpredictable, often catastrophic. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, major storms, earthquakes.
And people then, they didn't have the scientific explanations we have now, did they?
Not at all. The underlying causes of all this misfortune were largely a complete mystery. There was no germ theory, no modern meteorology, no real agricultural science as we understand it. It just happened.
So when you're facing that kind of overwhelming uncertainty, when you absolutely cannot understand or control the forces that seem to be constantly threatening your life, your family, your community, what do you do?
Well, what's the natural human response, right?
Yeah.
You search for an explanation. You look for something, or more often, someone to blame.
Makes sense. It imposes some kind of order, even if it's a terrifying order.
Exactly. So it became incredibly common for misfortunes, illness, bad weather, failed crops, even just bad luck to be attributed to external, malevolent, and often supernatural forces. It offered a kind of perverse logic to an otherwise chaotic and terrifying world.
A way to make sense of the senseless.
Precisely. And this profound lack of scientific understanding, combined with just inherent societal instability and constant hardship, it cultivated this psychological climate that was just exquisitely ripe for the emergence of what sociologists much later would call moral panics.
Fertile ground.
Extremely fertile ground. The collective fear, the deep-seated uncertainty of the population could be incredibly easily channeled, even manipulated.
Yeah.
People instinctively look to identify folk devils.
Or devils.
Yeah, specific groups or individuals who could be conveniently scapegoated for broader societal problems, or maybe internal anxieties, or sometimes just simple bad luck. Somebody had to be responsible.
And the scapegoating process, it becomes a coping mechanism.
A crucial one, yeah. For a society under immense stress, it allowed them to externalize their deep internal anxieties onto a perceived, maybe even tangible, enemy. It's a pattern you see again and again throughout history, a really foundational social dynamic that takes powerful root in this medieval period.
Okay, so we have this backdrop of pervasive fear, vulnerability, this search for scapegoats. Now let's layer onto that another equally immense force, the Catholic Church.
Right, because in medieval Europe, the church wasn't just a religious institution. For much of the period, it was the dominant cultural, political, and social force. Its authority was constantly expanding.
And reaching into very personal parts of life.
Absolutely. Extending its reach into the most intimate and private aspects of individual lives, particularly when it came to sexuality and moral conduct. Control was paramount.
For instance?
Well, take the church's view on sodomy. It was unequivocally viewed not merely as a sin, but as a mortal sin. A crime against nature, they called it, of the highest order.
And this condemnation became stricter over time.
Increasingly so, yes. Stricter and more intensely applied over the centuries, with escalating ecclesiastical and eventually secular penalties. Think public humiliation, mutilation, even death.
Wow. And beyond specific acts, there was a broader view of sexuality?
Very much so. The church actively promoted extreme asceticism. Complete celibacy was the ideal, even encouraged within marriage for those striving for spiritual perfection. For everyone else, sanctioned sexual activity was rigidly limited only to procreation.
So pleasure itself was a suspect.
Explicitly so. The very idea of sexual enjoyment, especially any form that wasn't directly aimed at conception, was often framed as inherently sinful, potentially even demonic.
That sounds like, well, a recipe for immense psychological and social pressure.
Absolutely. This incredibly rigid sexual code, you could argue, paradoxically created an environment of what some historical sources actually describe as intolerable sexual frustration and sexual obsession.
Right. It's almost like by trying to suppress what are called deviance so completely. The church maybe inadvertently fostered its perception, its taboo allure, perhaps even its hidden practice in the shadows. This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Indeed. Because what we start to see is how the church strategically began to demonize pre-existing traditional practices. Many old pagan customs, communal rites, things that had often revolved around fertility, the cycles of nature, communal pleasure.
Things that had maybe existed for centuries.
Exactly. Suddenly these practices found themselves reinterpreted, condemned, through this new, rigid Christian lens. And for the common folk who'd inherited these traditions, they sometimes became appealing forms of, well, countercultural expression, maybe even quiet rebellion against the church's increasingly ascetic and controlling doctrines.
And the church didn't just disapprove, did they? It was more than that.
Oh, much more. It was a deliberate, calculated reinterpretation. They didn't just say these practices were wrong or misguided, they actively condemned them as satanic, as manifestations of a forbidden carnal lust.
That's a powerful rhetorical move, linking tradition to the ultimate evil.
It was a profound act of theological rebranding, you could say. And this systematic transformation of traditional, often indigenous practices into perceived demonic threats, it highlights a pretty direct causal link between extreme religious repression and the emergence, or at least the perception, of countercultural practices that were then framed as deeply threatening.
So by framing anything outside its specific doctrine, its specific moral code, as inherently evil,
the church effectively legitimized its suppression. It was a remarkably efficient means of social and spiritual control. It created a clear enemy where perhaps only different customs or beliefs had existed before.
Okay, so we have the social anxieties, the church's tightening grip on morality, especially sex, and the demonization of older practices. What provided this sort of ideological framework for all this?
That's where the theological development of Satan and demonic influence really comes in. Christian theology itself underwent a pretty profound evolution in its understanding and portrayal of Satan and his power in the world.
It wasn't always so focused on a powerful, active Satan.
Early Christian views were certainly incorporating prohibitions from the Hebrew Bible against things like male sexual acts and what we now call gender nonconformity. But as Christianity gained state power...
especially with the Roman Empire adopting it.
Exactly. We see those theological condemnations quickly translate into secular law. Laws emerged specifically punishing gender-variant individuals and same-sex attracted men, often explicitly associating their practices with lingering paganism, idolatry, a threat to the new Christian order.
So it moved from sin to crime.
It became embedded directly into the legal and social fabric. You had incredibly influential church fathers, figures like Augustine, shaping Western thought for centuries. He drew a direct causal line between sex between males and the biblical destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Solidifying sodomite as this incredibly loaded, damning term.
Precisely. A label burdened with divine wrath, which unfortunately persisted for centuries, justifying persecution. And then you have others like John Chrysostom, another powerful voice, vehemently denouncing male love as monstrous, even a plague upon society.
Yeah.
Strong language.
Very strong. And this theological condemnation gets written into law.
Meticulously codified, cementing its pervasive impact. Justinian's code, issued way back in 534 CE, is a critical turning point. It explicitly linked same-sex acts to divine wrath, even suggesting they caused natural disasters like earthquakes and famines.
Blaming people for earthquakes. Wow.
Yeah, and this legal precedent casts an incredibly long shadow, influencing Western European law and social attitudes for hundreds and hundreds of years. By the 11th century, sodomy wasn't just a sin you confess, it was a serious criminal offense.
With horrific penalty.
Mutilation, castration, often death by burning. Really horrific stuff.
And the legal and theological arguments just kept escalating.
Relentlessly. By the 13th century, you have figures like Thomas Aquinas, arguably one of the most influential theologians and philosophers of the entire medieval period, systematically entrenching these condemnations even further in his work.
Okay.
He meticulously constructed arguments about why homosexuality was unnatural, placing it as an offense against God's design for sexuality, second only to bestiality in its depravity. This created a hierarchy of sin that deeply impacted scholastic thought and consequently wider societal prejudice for centuries.
And this demonization, it wasn't just abstract theology or law, right? It affected symbols too.
Oh, absolutely. It extended to a deliberate symbolic transformation of pre-Christian beliefs and figures. Ancient pagan deities like Pan, the horned fertility god, often associated with wildness, ecstatic rites.
Often depicted with goat legs.
That's the one. He and figures like him were consciously reinterpreted, rebranded as Satan, the ultimate adversary. Similarly, traditional gatherings, festivals like the Roman Bacchanals, ancient rites celebrating pleasure, ecstasy, fertility, they were systematically reimagined and depicted as terrifying witches' Sabbaths.
So joyful gatherings become demonic orgies.
Yeah, exactly. Their associated sexual rites, once perhaps expressions of life and abundance, were grotesquely twisted in these narratives into manifestations of forbidden carnal lust and explicit devil worship. This intentional construction of evil, using familiar but repurposed imagery, provided a chillingly effective justification for widespread persecution.
So what we're really seeing here isn't just some gradual shift in belief. It feels more like a foundational, almost radical redefinition of morality itself.
I think that's right. It profoundly impacted societal attitudes, legal practices, the very perception of identity. This systematic redefinition effectively created the other, solidifying who was deemed outside the bounds of acceptable society, and therefore a legitimate target for the escalating fear and persecution that characterized these moral panics.
Okay, that's a really powerful and quite disturbing groundwork. With that laid, let's turn our focus now to one of the most potent and I think enduring figures at the heart of so many of these medieval fears. The witch.
Ah, yes, the witch.
The perception of what a witch even was seems to have undergone this dramatic, terrifying change over the medieval period, didn't it? Going from maybe a local superstition to this full-blown demonic conspiracy threatening society itself.
That's a very accurate summary. Initially, for a long time, accusations of witchcraft were often quite sporadic. They were frequently tied to local folk magic practices, things like herbalism, maybe lingering pagan beliefs in rural areas.
So, like, if your cow got sick, you might blame the strange old woman down the lane.
Exactly. If crops failed, livestock fell ill, a child died unexpectedly. Misfortune might be attributed to an outsider in the village, maybe a reclusive woman, someone who just didn't conform to community norms. These were usually about individual harms, maleficium, causing specific damage, and they were often resolved locally, sometimes even through counter magic or reconciliation.
But that changed. That perception hardened significantly, especially in the late medieval period.
Dramatically. The church's view shifted. Witchcraft was no longer seen as just a mere superstition or simple harmful magic. It got elevated to the gravest of heresies, direct devil worship.
So the witch herself transformed in the public imagination.
Completely, from maybe a local practitioner of questionable folk remedies or curses into a malicious, genuinely supernatural being, a direct agent of Satan, engaged in malevolent acts on a grand scale as part of this vast conspiracy against God and humanity.
So what did this terrifying shift actually mean for the people accused? What were they supposedly doing?
It meant they were believed to be using maleficium, black magic, not just to cause harm locally, but as an act of absolute rebellion against God and Christian society. The alleged practices described in texts and trials became much more elaborate and horrifying.
Such as?
Casting devastating curses using magical objects, often gruesome substances allegedly including victims' body parts in their rituals. Witches were thought to possess demonic familiars.
Familiars like black cats.
Cats, owls, toads. Yeah, often animals said to be lesser demons in disguise, helping them carry out their evil deeds. And they were even believed to be able to shapeshift into animals themselves. You can imagine the sheer terror this kind of belief instilled in communities.
Absolutely. And then came the idea of the pact with the devil.
That was the truly crucial and frankly horrifying development. The assertion that witches weren't just practicing harmful magic semi-independently, but that they had explicitly, consciously renounced Christ and made a binding diabolical pact with the devil himself.
Like signing a contract in blood.
That kind of imagery, yes.
Yeah.
And this pact was supposedly sealed through perverse rituals, including performing black masses, sacrilegious inversions of the Christian liturgy, mocking the most sacred rites.
And the sabbats. The witches' gatherings.
These sabbats, or covens, often depicted as secret nocturnal gatherings in remote places like forests or mountains, were described with increasingly lurid, terrifying details. Scenes of extreme transgression, cannibalism, especially of infants, incest, rampant open nudity, worshippers supposedly adoring Satan, who appeared in corporeal form, maybe as a black goat or a man.
Good heavens.
These beliefs position witches not merely as a local problem or individual sinners, but as an organized existential threat to the very foundations of Christian society. A demonic fifth column.
So how did the official church, like the Inquisition, get involved in prosecuting this? Weren't they initially focused more on heresy, like doctrinal disputes?
They were. The Inquisition, established back in the 13th century, was primarily tasked with rooting out heresy, incorrect beliefs, challenges to doctrine. Initially, they often viewed witchcraft accusations with some skepticism, sometimes dismissing them as unimportant superstition, folk beliefs, or even delusions.
But that changed.
It began to change significantly in the late medieval period, particularly accelerating in the 15th century. As the belief in magic as inherently heretical as stemming from demonic power, and thus a direct challenge to God's omnipotence, gained serious traction within influential theological circles, the Inquisition's approach hardened. They started to see witchcraft not just as superstition, but as a grave heresy in itself, demanding systematic and often brutal persecution.
And then came a specific book that really threw gasoline on the fire, right?
Ah, yes. A pivotal, frankly terrifying moment that codified this new, horrifying understanding of witchcraft. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum.
The Hammer of Witches.
Exactly. Published in 1487 by a Dominican inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer. And this book wasn't just another theological argument. It was an incredibly detailed, comprehensive, and deeply influential guide.
A how-to manual for witch hunting.
Essentially, yes. It meticulously detailed how to identify witches, how to prosecute them, crucially, how to use torture to extract confessions, and ultimately how to execute them. It profoundly influenced European witch hunts for the next 2 centuries. It acted as a manual for terror and an instruction guide for torture methods.
What did it actually claim about witches?
The Malleus declared witchcraft the most abominable of all heresies, a crime against God second to none. It asserted, absolutely, that witchcraft involved total devotion to evil, often sealed through explicit sexual relationships with demons incubi, the male demons who preyed on women, or succubi, the female demons tempting men.
Sex with demons became central.
Absolutely central. It detailed the renunciation of the Christian faith, the desecration of sacraments, and, horrifyingly, the alleged sacrifice of unbaptized infants to Satan. What's truly chilling here is how this one book, written largely by one obsessed individual, could codify fear on such a massive scale. It legitimized torture as a necessary tool and justified widespread violence unlike almost anything before it.
And it elevated the diabolical pact, the agreement with the devil.
It absolutely elevated the pact to the central, often unchallengeable charge in virtually all subsequent witch trials across Europe. Its influence was just devastatingly effective. It made witch trials more systematized, more legally justified, and ultimately far more brutal and widespread than they might have been otherwise.
And when we talk about these witch hunts, there's an undeniable, deeply disturbing pattern regarding who is accused, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. A truly chilling and undeniable aspect was the profound gender bias. While some men certainly were accused and executed as witches or warlocks,
The overwhelming majority were women.
a considerable number, as one source puts it, which is a massive understatement, the vast, overwhelming majority of those targeted, tortured, and killed were women. And this wasn't accidental. It was both a direct reflection of and a tool to reinforce the prevailing misogynistic societal norms and attitudes of the time.
Which women were most vulnerable?
Independent women, outspoken women, widowed women, especially those who inherited property and managed their own affairs, women healers or midwives, anyone really who didn't conform neatly to the narrow prescribed traditional gender roles for women: wife, mother, obedient daughter. They became incredibly convenient scapegoats for all sorts of societal anxieties, especially anxieties of social order and shifting or challenged male power.
And the Malleus Maleficarum itself plays into this misogyny.
It's practically a monument to it. The book explicitly, repeatedly claims that witchcraft stems fundamentally from women's insatiable carnal lust. It argues that women are inherently weaker in faith, more superstitious, more easily swayed by the devil, more prone to temptation through their bodies.
So it directly links female sexuality to evil.
Directly and graphically. It links women's bodies, their sexuality, particularly any form of non-procreative pleasure or desire, to inherent deviancy and demonic corruption. It goes so far as to portray female sexual pleasure itself as inherently evil, something only possible with the devil's direct assistance, framing it as a literal pact with evil through sex. It's deeply disturbing stuff.
So imagine you were a female healer back then. Maybe a village midwife.
Right. Once perhaps a respected, essential figure in your community, dispensing herbal remedies, assisting with childbirth,
You'd face increasing danger.
increasing oppression and suspicion, absolutely, especially from the 13th century onward. This coincided with the rise of formally trained male physicians and a deliberate push towards systematized, university-based medicine institutions that almost entirely excluded women.
So if these women continued to practice healing outside that official system,
They were increasingly vulnerable to being charged under canon law, the church's law, and rebranded. Not as healers, but as witches using demonic magic.
and midwives were particularly targeted.
Terribly so. They were tragically accused of infanticide, of deliberately killing newborns as gruesome sacrifices to Satan, particularly if an infant died during or shortly after birth, which was tragically common. The entire legal framework that developed around witch trials was meticulously crafted, you could argue, to sexualize women, control their bodies, and police their roles.
Linking alleged sexual crimes with the devil to justify harsher sentences.
Precisely. Torture, execution. And laws like the English 1533 Buggery Act, which criminalized sodomy and other non-procreative sexual acts, further contributed to this systemic control of sexuality, reinforcing the idea that only procreative sex within marriage was legitimate. Anything else could be suspect, even demonic.
It really feels like the systematic targeting just cemented the idea that woman and witch were practically interchangeable in the popular imagination.
It contributed significantly to that devastating perception, yes. And this terrifying shift was inextricably linked to the church's overarching desire for social control, its need to enforce conformity, and its deeply, deeply entrenched misogynistic views on female sexuality and power. It effectively transformed women, especially non-conforming women, into powerful folk devils, making them convenient scapegoats and enforcing rigid adherence to a very narrow patriarchal set of norms.
Now, beyond witches, medieval authorities were also relentlessly pursuing various other groups, weren't they? Those labeled as heretics who dared to challenge Orthodox Church doctrine.
Yes, absolutely. Heresy was seen as a profound threat, a spiritual contagion that could endanger the entire community's salvation.
And there seems to be a chillingly common thread in the accusations leveled against many of these dissenting groups, this recurring specter of ecstatic orgies and other really transgressive acts.
That's right. Charges involving illicit, often secret or nocturnal gatherings, ritual murder, especially of children, cannibalism, sacrilegious acts like spitting on the cross, or adoring Satan in corporeal form. These became almost standard procedure, a kind of template accusation used against almost any group perceived as outside the normal customs or orthodox beliefs of Christian society.
Sounds like a playbook.
The sheer recurring nature of these specific accusations, used against incredibly diverse groups, sometimes separated geographically by vast distances and even centuries, strongly suggests it was a common polemical strategy employed by authorities
A strategy, too.
to demonize perceived threats, first and foremost, to to isolate them from the general populace by painting them as monstrous and inhuman, and ultimately to consolidate control by presenting them as this unholy conspiracy that needed to be stamped out. It was remarkably effective propaganda.
Can we look at some specific examples? Because this pattern is really striking.
Sure, it goes way back. As early as the 4th century, you have the Priscillianists, a Christian ascetic sect in Spain, and also the Montanists in North Africa. Both were distinct movements, but both ended up accused of holding orgies and even committing ritual child murders.
And is there evidence for this?
Modern historical analysis has consistently shown there was likely no real basis for these specific lurid charges against those early groups. It highlights just how far back these stereotypical accusations go, serving as a convenient tool for suppressing any perceived religious or social deviance almost from the start.
Okay, moving forward in time.
To the late 12th century, you have the Waldensians. They were a reformist Christian movement originating in the Alps who sought to live simply, preach directly from the Bible in the vernacular, and challenged church wealth. They faced widespread condemnation and brutal persecution for centuries.
And the orgy accusations were used against them too?
Explicitly. Accusations of nocturnal orgiastic gatherings and demonic covens weren't just local rumors. They were officially characterized against the Waldensians by Pope Gregory X himself in a papal bull called Vox in Rama in 1233. This papal pronouncement gave these accusations immense weight and authority, basically sanctioning their persecution as devil worshippers.
Then there were the Fraticelli.
Yes, a radical offshoot of the Franciscan order, active from the 13th to 15th centuries. They advocated for absolute poverty, following St. Francis's rule strictly, which put them in conflict with the wealthier church hierarchy. They became notorious targets for accusations of devil worship, cannibalism, and a specific grotesque alleged practice called barolato.
Which was?
Supposedly ritual infanticide, the killing of a child born from their promiscuous rites, followed by more promiscuous orgies. Again, these charges were clearly designed to strip them of any moral legitimacy and paint them as monstrous.
And probably the most famous example of these kinds of accusations being used politically.
Has to be the Knights Templar in the early 14th century. This was an immensely wealthy, powerful international military religious order, veterans of the Crusades. They were spectacularly destroyed by the French king, Philip the Fair.
Oh.
Philip, who owed the Templars a lot of money and coveted their wealth and power, orchestrated a campaign using accusations of impiety, blasphemy, spitting on the cross, idolatry, and most notably, forcing initiates into homosexual acts, sodomy. These confessions were almost entirely extracted under horrific torture.
And the outcome?
The order was suppressed, its leaders burned at the stake, and its vast assets seized by the king and, to some extent, other orders. Modern scholarship has largely, if not entirely, cleared the Templars of these specific charges, underscoring the nakedly political and financial motivation behind these dramatic accusations. It's a textbook case of a moral panic being weaponized.
What about the Brethren of the Free Spirit? They sound intriguing.
They were a widespread, rather amorphous, and often controversial mystical movement or tendency, flourishing from the 13th to 15th centuries. They were frequently accused by authorities of total immoralism and extreme sexual promiscuity.
Based on what beliefs?
Based on a radical theological idea called antinomianism, the belief that, having achieved a certain state of spiritual perfection or union with God, they were literally incapable of sin. Therefore, conventional moral laws no longer applied to them.
So, anything goes.
That was the accusation. Their supposed Adam cult reportedly involved things like ritual nudity, lavish banquets rejecting asceticism, and frantic, ecstatic dances, sometimes culminating in orgies. The idea supposedly was to restore a paradisiac condition of primordial innocence before the fall. Whether these reports were entirely accurate or heavily exaggerated by hostile sources is debated, but that they certainly revealed deep societal anxieties about unchecked spiritual and sexual freedom outside church control.
And the Cathars. They were another major target in southern France.
Yes, the Cathars, or Albigensians, active from the 12th to 14th centuries. They held dualist beliefs, seeing the material world as evil, created by a lesser god, and only the spiritual world as good. This led them to reject many Catholic sacraments, the authority of the Church, and often procreation. The picture, with accusations against them, is a bit more complex. While some inquisitorial sources did accuse Cathars, particularly their lay followers, of sodomy and incest, common charges against heretics, other inquisitors, interestingly, actually defended their elite group, the perfects, their most ascetic spiritual leaders who lived lives of extreme self-denial from charges of sexual debauchery. They emphasized that the perfects strict asceticism and rejection of marriage and all sexual contact.
So the accusers weren't even consistent.
It demonstrates the varying interpretations and perhaps the selective application of these standard accusations, even within the same persecuting authority. It depended on who was being targeted and perhaps what narrative was most useful at the time.
Even earlier, you mentioned the Orleans Heresy in 1022.
Yes, a very early case. Contemporary accounts written by horrified Orthodox clerics, of course, mention lurid details. A blasphemous Eucharist supposedly made of the ashes of dead infants, sex orgies, spitting on the cross during initiation, and explicit devil worship.
And are those accounts reliable?
They are now widely recognized by historians as heavily embellished and bearing striking similarities to the stereotypical accusations leveled against other marginalized groups throughout history, like early Christians by the Romans or Jews. It highlights this recurring playbook of demonization through shocking, often sexualized, allegations.
Fast forward again to the 15th century, the Taborites in Bohemia.
They were a radical wing of the Hussite movement, which was itself a major challenge to church authority. An extreme faction within the Taborites, sometimes called the Picardi or Bohemian Adamites, reportedly lived in a kind of unconditional communal arrangement, meaning, according to hostile accounts, that traditional marriage was considered a sin, and promiscuity was actually seen as obligatory, a way of rejecting worldly attachments and achieving spiritual liberation. They were widely accused by horrified observers of performing ritual dances naked around a fire, engaging in what was perceived as uncontrolled, wild, and deeply immoral behavior.
And lastly, the Anabaptists in Minster.
A famous dramatic episode. During their brief but radical messianic reign in the city of Minster from 1533 to 1535, under leaders like John of Leyden.
They took over the city.
Yes, establishing a kind of radical theocracy. Polygamy was officially legalized and even mandated for women. Hostile contemporary accounts written after the city was brutally retaken vividly describe sumptuous banquets, a general atmosphere of supposed dissoluteness, and sexual behavior shifting dramatically towards promiscuity again, all framed as proof of their utter deviance and a justification for the siege and massacre that ended their rule.
This a litany of accusations across centuries and groups. It really raises a crucial question, doesn't it? Which cuts right to the heart of this whole deep dive.
It absolutely does. It forces us to confront the fundamental difficulty. How do we distinguish between these often formulaic, polemical accusations, charges fabricated or wildly exaggerated for political or religious ends, and the actual, often far more complex and nuanced practices of these groups?
Because many of these accusations were just stereotypes, borrowed from earlier attacks.
Many were indeed stereotypical, yes. They strikingly mirrored accusations made against early Christians by Roman authorities centuries before, or against Jewish communities throughout the medieval period, with the horrific blood libel, the false accusation of murdering Christian children for rituals. It seems to be a standard toolkit for demonizing the other.
However, were these accusations always pure fabrication?
That's the complex part. Historical analysis does indicate that in some instances, specific practices involving, say, communal living, rejection of traditional marriage, perhaps forms of sexual promiscuity, sometimes accompanied by lavish banquets or ecstatic dances. These things were occasionally well attested and rooted in particular philosophical premises, according to some scholars.
So there might have been a kernel of truth, even if distorted.
Possibly, in some cases. These practices, when they did occur, often stemmed from that theological concept we mentioned earlier, antinomianism.
The idea that the spiritually perfected are beyond sin.
Exactly. The radical belief that moral laws, particularly those of the established church or society, just don't apply to those who've achieved a certain enlightened spiritual state. This was sometimes coupled with dualistic worldviews, seeing the material world and its rules as corrupt and communal living arrangements that deliberately rejected traditional societal norms, like private property or monogamous marriage.
And in that context, certain acts could be seen differently.
In such specific, often marginalized contexts, transgressive acts, including non-reproductive sexual practices, were sometimes interpreted by the participants themselves not as sin, but perhaps as a means to unleash supreme creative power, achieve spiritual liberation from material constraints, or even actively restore a kind of lost paradisical state. The Church, of course, interpreted any such deviation through only one lens: pure satanic perversion and rebellion.
So, looking at the bigger picture, these widespread accusations of ecstatic orgies and sexual transgression, whether based on reality or fabrication, served a dual purpose, didn't they?
A profoundly effective dual purpose, yes. On the one hand, They powerfully demonized any dissenting religious movements or challenging social groups, stripping them of moral credibility and justifying their often violent suppression.
And on the other hand,
They simultaneously worked to aggressively reinforce the church's increasingly rigid sexual morality, which, as we discussed, was already incredibly strict and focused on procreation within marriage. By portraying any deviation from orthodox doctrine and from those narrow sexual norms as inherently satanic, unholy, and an existential threat to the Christian social order. These moral panics masterfully leveraged existing societal anxieties, fear of chaos, fear of the unknown, fear of divine punishment, and deep-seated religious dogma to suppress any perceived challenge to established power structures, both religious and secular.
it really demonstrates how powerful institutions can deftly use the fear of deviance, especially sexual deviance, to maintain and consolidate their control.
Absolutely. They create this terrifying, visible enemy, often out of marginalized groups, and then conveniently provide the solution, which is usually conformity, obedience, and often persecution of the designated scapegoats. Framing any challenge to their authority as a direct threat to the very fabric of society or the salvation of souls proved devastatingly effective for centuries, with truly horrific consequences for those labeled as outsiders.
Now, it's often easy to assume that these strict medieval religious orders, especially the monasteries and nunneries requiring vows of celibacy, were completely heteronormative spaces, right? Devoid of any deviation from those strict rules.
That's certainly the traditional image, and often the one the institutions themselves wanted to project.
But the historical record, when you actually dig into it, seems to tell a much richer, more complex, and frankly, quite different story.
It really does. There's compelling, though sometimes subtle or coded, evidence of same-sex relationships and deep emotional, even romantic attractions within medieval monastic orders. And this evidence directly challenges those simplistic, heteronormative narratives that have often dominated historical accounts of monastic life.
Where does this evidence come from? It seems unlikely to be in official records.
Often it comes from surprisingly intimate sources, their own personal writings, things like deeply moving love letters exchanged between monks or nuns, passionate poetry, even mystical visions that seem to blur the lines between spiritual devotion and intense earthly affection for another person of the same sex.
And these relationships were often described euphemistically.
Yes, very often labeled by observers, or perhaps even by the individuals themselves in certain contexts as special friendships, spiritual brotherhood, or intense spiritual bonds. That was often the acceptable language. However, upon closer reading, the emotional intensity, the language used, the despair expressed at separation, it often points towards profound romantic and, in many instances, implicitly or even explicitly sexual components. These were clearly expressions of deep personal affection that went far beyond simple companionship or mentorship.
And can you give us some examples?
Sure. We have some truly moving and quite illuminating examples from these personal writings. Take Alcuin, who was a very influential scholar and a key advisor to Charlemagne back in the late 700s. He composed a poem addressed to his fellow scholar, Arno of Salzburg, that contains lines like, "Love has penetrated my heart with its flame."
That's pretty intense language for the 8th century, even between men in a monastic setting.
It really is. Or consider the letters of Anselm of Canterbury, a hugely important figure in medieval theology, writing around 1077 or 1078. His letters to his beloved student and fellow monk Gilbert convey this incredibly deep emotional dependence, even anguish, when they're separated. Anselm calls Gilbert his sweetest friend and writes about his desolate heart for its want of your love.
Wow.
Then you have Baudry of Beaujeu, an abbot and poet writing in the early 1100s. He wrote a poem to a monk named Walter where he speaks of sharing not just his heart and breast, but even his soul with Walter again, a clear indication of profound intimacy. These are far from casual sentiments being expressed.
And for women, nuns.
Perhaps even more explicitly, we find these astonishing documents known as the Bavarian nun love poems from the 1100s. These contain lines exchanged between nuns that are unmistakably passionate, sensual even. Lines like, "When I recall the kisses you gave me, and how with tender words you caressed my little breasts, I want to die because I cannot see you."
Goodness, that's not subtle.
Not at all. This is not just spiritual friendship. It's explicitly physical, sensual, and filled with longing. And much later, jumping forward, you have someone like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, an extraordinary Mexican nun, poet, and scholar in the late 1600s. She wrote these passionate, deeply intellectual letters to a vicereine, asserting that for the soul, distance and sex don't count, implying a deep connection beyond physical presence or conventional norms.
These examples are incredibly powerful. They really demonstrate the human experience of love, desire, connection, transcending these strict societal and religious norms, even within the supposedly closed-off walls of monasteries and convents. It points to a rich, often hidden queer history.
Absolutely. And beyond these individual relationships documented in letters and poems, there's also the practice of brother-making ceremonies among monks, sometimes called adelphopoiesis. It was a kind of ritualized adoption or bond, creating a special kinship. While often spiritual, some historical analyses suggest that in certain instances, it may also have had a romantic or even implicitly sexual dimension, further hinting at the nuanced and often unacknowledged realities of same-sex intimacy within monastic life. It wasn't necessarily formalized or celebrated by the institution, but it seems to have been part of the lived experience for some.
Let's maybe turn to some prominent historical figures whose lives offer fascinating, sometimes challenging glimpses into these realities. Hildegard of Bingen comes to mind. She's incredibly famous.
Yes, Hildegard, who lived from approximately 1098 to 1179. A truly remarkable figure. German abbess, mystic, visionary, composer, scientist, writer, just an intellectual powerhouse. Now with Hildegard, direct, explicit sexual evidence regarding her relationships is lacking. We don't have those kinds of confessions or explicit letters.
But there are interpretations.
Scholarly interpretations certainly suggest what we might today describe as queer proclivities or a strong focus on female relationships. For instance, in her theological writings, she included a piece condemning female fornication quite strongly. Some scholars read this with a touch of irony, hinting at the classic, "the lady doth protest too much," especially given the prevailing societal disbelief that women were even capable of having meaningful sex with each other. It wasn't seen as a real sin in the same way male sodomy was.
Interesting. What about her other writings?
While her extensive medical texts are quite revealing, they go into considerable detail about female bodies, humors, and even sex appeal, describing how women attract each other based on their physical constitutions. Yet these texts conspicuously lack similar descriptive passages about male bodies or male appeal. This suggests to some interpreters a very clear, perhaps even sensual focus on women in her understanding of the body and attraction.
And her relationship with Richardus.
Ah, yes. Most notably, Hildegard had an exceptionally close and passionate relationship with her secretary and protege, a young noblewoman named Richardus von Stade. When Richardus's family arranged for her to leave Hildegard's monastery to become abbess elsewhere, Hildegard fought bitterly against it. Her letters expressing her profound grief, anger, and longing for Richardus's return read strikingly like what we would recognize today as intense, almost desperate, angry, sad post-breakup letters. They reveal raw, profound emotions over the separation and a deep personal bond that seems to transcend simple mentorship. It's a remarkable testament to their connection.
Okay, moving into a much more explicit and also quite tragic case, Benedetta Carlini.
Yes, Benedetta Carlini, a 17th century abbess in Pescia, Italy. Her life, documented extensively through church investigations, offers abundant explicit evidence of same-sex sexual activity, intimately intertwined with profound mystical visions she claimed to receive.
What does she claim?
Benedetta claimed that Jesus himself had chosen her as his divine bride. She also described frequent visits from an angelic being named Splenditello, who she said would have intense physical intercourse with her. Crucially, she claims Splenditello used another nun in her convent, Sister Bartolomea Crivelli, as a physical surrogate for these encounters.
So she was having sex with another nun, but claiming it was divinely mandated.
That was her claim. And Sister Bartolomea's detailed confession given during the church's investigation meticulously described the explicit sexual nature of these encounters involving kissing, caressing, and what was described as mutual stimulation. Bartolomea's testimony also indicated, however, that she felt coerced by Benedetta, who held power as the abbess and claimed divine authority.
How did the church handle this? It must have been scandalous.
It was deeply problematic for them. They were faced with explicit descriptions of same-sex acts between nuns, but they struggled to prosecute Benedetta for the crime of sodomy, as it was then legally defined. Their legal definitions often required literal penetration for the crime to be fully realized, especially between women, which was often deemed impossible or not real sodomy.
So what happened to her?
Despite Benedetta maintaining an unwavering belief in the divine origin of her visions and experiences right to the end, the church authorities ultimately condemned her, not explicitly for sodomy, but for blasphemy and feigning miracles. She was sentenced to a life of strict confinement, literally walled into a tiny cell within the convent for the remaining 35 years of her life. It's a tragic and incredibly complex case, revealing the Church's intense struggle with female spiritual authority, female sexuality, and how to categorize experiences that blurred the lines between mystical ecstasy and forbidden acts.
And then for a completely different kind of story, there's Julie d'Aubigny.
La Maupin, a truly scandalous, larger-than-life figure from 17th century France, an opera singer, a renowned swordswoman known for dueling men, and famous for her tumultuous affairs with both men and women. Her life reads like an adventure novel.
And she had a famous incident involving a nunnery.
Yes, one of her most legendary exploits. Julie fell in love with a young merchant's daughter, whose parents had placed her in a convent in Avignon, likely against her will. Julie wanted to rescue her lover.
So what did she do?
She concocted an audacious plan. She entered the convent, perhaps posing as a novice. When an elderly nun died, Julie placed the deceased nun's body in her girlfriend's bed. Then she deliberately set fire to the room, or perhaps the entire nunnery, creating chaos and diversion. Amidst the confusion, she fled with her lover into the night.
That's unbelievably bold. Did she get away with it?
Initially, yes, though she was subsequently tried in absentia, meaning while she was gone, and sentenced to death by burning fall for kidnapping, body snatching, arson, and failing to appear in court. However, the sentence was never carried out.
Why not?
Apparently, the authorities, upon investigating further, or perhaps just wanting to avoid further public scandal, found it too embarrassing or perhaps legally difficult to prosecute, based on the idea that a woman had committed such audacious, traditionally masculine acts. Some accounts suggest they effectively nullified the sentence by trying a fictional male version of her in the records, rendering the original sentence against the actual Julie d'Aubigny unenforceable upon her return.
Incredible. Her story really illustrates something different, doesn't it?
It really does. While clearly scandalous and punishable, her life story vividly illustrates the open acknowledgement, at least, of female same-sex relationships by broader society at the time. They weren't necessarily hidden or denied in the same way, even if they caused outrage. It's a powerful, if extreme, testament to defiance and survival in a world that tried to impose very strict limits, especially on women's lives and desires.
So thinking about these monastic stories, it's really vital to understand the broader societal and religious context that allowed for these relationships and also shaped the varied responses to them, right?
Absolutely. Monastic life, especially for women, and particularly noble women, often presented a unique and, in some ways, quite valuable social space.
How so?
Well, nuns were largely released from the immense societal pressure of conventional marriage and constant childbearing. They lived in communities composed entirely of women. This environment could offer a degree of autonomy, access to education for some, intellectual pursuits, and deep companionship, all largely outside the direct control of fathers or husbands in the intensely patriarchal structures of the secular world.
And that could be appealing to women who weren't heterosexual.
It certainly seems plausible that this environment would be particularly appealing to women we might now understand as queer women seeking autonomy, intellectual life, and intimate connections with other women, away from the demands of compulsory heterosexuality and marriage.
And you mentioned earlier this societal disbelief about sex between women.
Yes, that's a significant and somewhat paradoxical factor in the historical perception, or lack thereof, of female same-sex relationships. There was this pervasive societal, legal, and even theological disbelief that women were capable of having sex with each other in a way that truly mattered or constituted a serious crime like male sodomy.
Because it didn't involve penetration.
Largely, yes. Because male-centric legal and theological thought often defined sex, and particularly sodomy, primarily by the act of penetration. Female-female intimacy was frequently overlooked, misunderstood, dismissed as harmless affection, or simply deemed impossible to be sinful in the same serious way male sodomy was.
So despite church rules against unnatural acts.
Right. Despite vague ecclesiastical regulations against unnatural acts, which could theoretically cover anything non-procreative, this kind of lesbian erasure often meant that female same-sex relationships were simply ignored, not systematically sought out, or not formally condemned with anything near the same severity and obsessive fervor as male sodomy, which was seen as directly challenging patriarchal lineage, property inheritance, and biblical injunctions.
So putting it all together, while these relationships within monasteries weren't explicitly part of a satanic panic in the same overt conspiratorial way that witchcraft or heresy accusations were,
Right, they weren't usually framed as devil worship or a plot against society in that specific way.
they still represented a profound form of deviance from the church's strict norms, existing right within its own institutions.
Exactly. They existed within, and sometimes clearly challenged, the rigid religious frameworks of the time. Their documentation often surfaces indirectly, as we've seen, through personal writings like letters and poems, or, as in Benedetta Carlini's dramatic case, through being reinterpreted by authorities either as genuine mystical experiences, as Benedetta herself claimed, or as evidence of demonic influence and deception, as the Church ultimately concluded in her case.
It really reveals the selective nature of these moral panics, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The full force of the panic, the most systematic persecution, tended to focus with extreme intensity on threats that were perceived as directly challenging male-dominated power structures, established ecclesiastical authority, and especially procreative norms, basically. Anything that threatened established hierarchies, property lines, or the correct use of sexuality as defined by the Church.
Meanwhile, other forms of perceived deviance,
Particularly female same-sex intimacy, might be marginalized, dismissed, or simply rendered invisible by a lack of belief in their very possibility, or by their perceived lesser threat to the core structures of power. It's a striking example of how societal biases and preoccupations shaped exactly what was seen as dangerous, what was prosecuted, and what was simply ignored or erased from the dominant historical narrative.
Okay, so how do we pull all of this incredibly complex and often disturbing history together? We've looked at fear, the church, witches, heretics, sexuality. What we seem to have seen is that the medieval period, long before the term Satanic Panic was ever coined, clearly experienced phenomena that align remarkably closely with the modern sociological framework of moral panics.
That's a very good way to put it. These medieval episodes featured that heightened, often wildly exaggerated public attention focused on a perceived moral issue or a specific group deemed deviant. This was usually accompanied by inflated demands from authorities or moral entrepreneurs to control that supposed threat, leading inevitably to widespread public fear, outrage, and often punitive action.
And when sociologists today talk about moral panics, they identify some key characteristics, right?
Yeah.
Do those map onto the medieval situation?
They map incredibly well. Let's run through them. First, concern. You see a noticeable, often quite sudden spike in public worry and discourse over a particular group's behavior or existence.
Right.
Think witches, heretics, sodomites. Second, hostility. There's a clear escalation of antagonism towards these designated deviants. They're increasingly portrayed not just as wrongdoers, but as fundamental enemies of society, of God, of the natural order.
Got it.
Third, consensus. At least a minimal societal agreement, or the appearance of one fostered by authorities, forms that the threat posed by this group is real, serious, and substantial, even if this consensus is built on rumor, fear, and flimsy or coerced evidence.
Right, like the confessions under torture.
Exactly. Fourth, disproportionality. This is key. The reaction, the fear, the outrage, the legal measures taken is wildly out of proportion to any actual objective harm posed by the group in question. The perceived threat is magnified enormously.
And finally,
Volatility. Moral panics can be unpredictable. Some might flare up intensely and then die down relatively quickly, perhaps after a scapegoat is punished. Others, however, can persist for extended periods, simmering or erupting periodically and leading to lasting social changes, new laws, and deep-seated prejudices, as we've certainly seen with the legacies of medieval panics.
so in this medieval context, figures like witches, the various groups branded as heretics, individuals whose sexualities or gender expressions were deemed deviant. They were systematically constructed as what sociologists call folk devils.
Precisely. These folk devils served as powerful, tangible, visible reminders of what we should not be, as one theorist put it. They came to embody a threatening moral malaise that supposedly imperiled the very soul of Christian society. They became the externalized manifestation of all those internal anxieties about sin, chaos, and divine punishment.
And the communication channels of the time played a crucial role in spreading this fear.
Absolutely critical. The mass media of the medieval period, which included incredibly powerful church sermons delivered from virtually every pulpit, influential theological treatises circulated among the literate elite, who were often the judges and authorities, and those brutal inquisitorial manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, they didn't just report on existing beliefs. They actively amplified the fear. They solidified public perception of these groups as dangerous, malevolent enemies.
How did they do that?
These sources consistently presented the supposed threats in a stylized and stereotypical fashion, creating these consistent, easily digestible narratives of evil conspiracies. The baby-eating witches, the orgiastic heretics, the sodomites bringing down God's wrath. These narratives reinforced the fear and made the folk devils seem undeniably real and terrifying. If we connect this to the bigger picture, You can see just how powerfully narratives are constructed and weaponized even today to shape perception and control populations.
Absolutely. It makes you realize the medieval Satanic Panic, or perhaps we should say series of panics, wasn't just one thing. It was this complex, interlocking interplay of factors.
Exactly. Driven by religious dogma, certainly, but also by pervasive societal anxieties about survival, and frequently by naked political opportunism.
Let's break that down. The religious driver.
On the religious front, the church often acted as a primary moral entrepreneur, actively seeking out and defining immorality and disrespect for religion wherever it saw fit. It meticulously defined deviance, whether theological or behavioral, as heresy, and explicitly linked heresy and serious sin to the direct influence of Satan. This provided the powerful theological justification, the divine mandate almost, for severe persecution, including torture and execution. This religious authority provided the foundational narrative that allowed the panics to take root and seem legitimate.
But it wasn't just about faith. There were political motivations too.
Crucially, yes. These moral panics frequently served clear political ends. They became incredibly convenient tools for consolidating power, settling scores, or achieving material gain. Panics could be exploited for personal vendettas, for the legal confiscation of property from the accused, which should be very lucrative, or simply for removing socially undesirable or politically inconvenient individuals or entire groups.
Like King Philip the Fair and the Knights Templar.
The absolute textbook example. His ruthless use of accusations of heresy and sodomy, extracted under brutal torture, allowed him to destroy an immensely wealthy and powerful rival institution and seize its assets. It highlights precisely how these panics could be cynically leveraged for political and economic consolidation. Even the Malleus Maleficarum, as we noted, while presented as this objective guide against the universal evil of witchcraft, also seems to have served as a personal response by its author, Heinrich Kramer, to the opposition and skepticism he faced from local authorities in some of his earlier witch-hunting attempts. He effectively reframed his personal frustrations and vendettas as a necessary war against a vast, terrifying societal problem, using the panic as both a shield and a weapon.
And beyond religion and politics, there's the element of social control, enforcing conformity.
A potent element, yes, particularly regarding gender. The accusations, especially those overwhelmingly leveled against women in the context of witchcraft, serve powerfully to aggressively reinforce existing gender divides and patriarchal power structures. They significantly contributed to what historians sometimes call the domestication of women, pushing them ever more forcefully into very narrow, subservient roles defined by marriage and childbearing.
So any deviation was risky.
Any deviation from prescribed physical appearance, social behavior, or accepted roles could swiftly lead to suspicion and potentially accusation. Women displaying assertiveness, holding independent ideas, possessing traditional knowledge outside the church's control, like healing, or engaging in non-domestic work. They were all at a significantly higher risk of accusation, simply for not conforming to the increasingly rigid gender norms. The accused witch became a terrifying cautionary tale for all other women. Stay in your place, or else.
So what really emerges from our deep dive today is this truly multifaceted phenomenon. You have the church acting as this unparalleled moral authority, masterfully leveraging these pre-existing societal anxieties about famine, plague, political instability, the general precariousness of life,
Deep-seated fears.
and combining them with its evolving, increasingly rigid theology of Satan and demonic influence to identify and then ruthlessly vilify these folk devils.
Whether they were labeled witches, heretics, sodomites, or something else, those who embraced non-procreative sexualities, those who challenged doctrine, those who simply didn't fit in, they became the convenient embodiment, the scapegoat for all of society's fears and misfortunes.
The widespread dissemination of these stereotypical accusations, the lurid tales of orgies, devil worship, infanticide through influential religious texts, frightening sermons, rumors, and eventually printed materials like the Malleus.
Inevitably led to brutal legal and social persecution, manifesting most horrifically in the widespread witch trials and the actions of the Inquisition, but also in broader social ostracization and violence.
And this whole complex process served multiple functions simultaneously, didn't it?
Absolutely. It powerfully reinforced those rigid social hierarchies, especially gender hierarchies. It exerted profound control over individual behavior, particularly policing female sexuality and autonomy. And it undeniably consolidated both religious and secular power by providing this tangible external enemy to blame for society's problems, uniting the faithful against the designated other. The sheer disproportionality of the reactions when compared to any plausible actual threats posed by these often marginalized groups stands as a defining and truly chilling characteristic of these historical panics. It's a stark reminder of how easily fear can be manufactured and weaponized with devastating human consequences.
So, wrapping up our deep dive today, what we've really seen is how medieval Europe, though obviously not using our modern term Satanic Panic, experienced intensely similar moral panics. They were built on these remarkably consistent foundations: pervasive fear, aggressive scapegoating, and the terrifying creation of folk devils.
Accusations of witchcraft, heresy, and various forms of sexual deviance, including, as we saw, the less acknowledged that historically present reality of same-sex relationships, even within monastic orders, were all deeply intertwined with evolving religious doctrines. These doctrines provided the seemingly ironclad theological justifications for widespread, often incredibly brutal, persecution.
The Malleus Maleficarum, as you said, stands as this stark, chilling monument to that era. A horrifying example of how deep-seated misogyny was systematically weaponized, linking female bodies, female agency, and female sexuality directly to perceived demonic threats and cosmic evil.
And this historical trajectory, tracing the line from ancient condemnations of unnatural acts through sophisticated medieval theological arguments by figures like Aquinas, right up to the legal codes and the witch hunts, demonstrates a long-standing, pervasive pattern. A pattern of religious and societal institutions attempting to exert control over private lives, particularly over bodies and sexualities deemed outside the established norms of procreation and patriarchal gender roles.
The pervasive use of moral panics, leveraging fear to consolidate power, enforce conformity, and suppress dissent, seems to be a tragically recurring theme throughout human history. Medieval Europe just provides an exceptionally stark, well-documented, and devastating illustration of its potential consequences.
Which is why understanding these medieval phenomena requires such careful, critical distinction. We constantly have to ask, what here might be verifiable historical fact, reflecting the complex lives and beliefs of actual people, and what was purely, or mostly, a polemical accusation, a charge deliberately designed to demonize, marginalize, and ultimately destroy individuals or groups.
Because the fears and stereotypes propagated during these medieval panics, particularly those targeting women, nonconformity, and non-procreative sexualities, they didn't just disappear, did they?
Not at all. They laid profoundly damaging foundational prejudices. Prejudices that regrettably influenced later societal perceptions, legal frameworks, and waves of persecution for centuries to come. Think, for instance, about the horrific blood libel against Jewish communities, the false accusation of ritual murder. It's tragically recognized by historians as perhaps the mother of all satanic conspiracies in the West, providing a template from which nearly all subsequent satanic accusations, including those in the modern era, have borrowed elements.
It really leaves us with a powerful, maybe unsettling thought to end on.
Which is?
How much of our modern anxieties are contemporary fears about secret cabals, our obsessions with perceived corruption or hidden agendas, our sometimes alarming quickness to demonize the other based on fear or misinformation? How much of that is truly new, and how much is just echoes of fears, patterns of scapegoating, and modes of control that have haunted humanity in different forms for centuries?
That is definitely something to deeply mull over. How much of the past is still truly present?